and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason, and with me today, returning to the show, is Reinis Lacis of the Handle podcast. Reinis, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be back, and it's always a fun time for me on Over and Back.
Cool. Well, always glad to have you and glad to know that you enjoyed as well. So today we're going to tackle a big topic. It might end up being a two-part episode, but you and I like to sometimes do that. We're talking about NBA retired numbers, and different teams have handled this in very different ways throughout history, as we'll kind of explore how teams have decided, which players, of course, they've decided to retire their numbers, what reasons are behind that, why, any inconsistencies we've seen, and things like that. I think it'll be an interesting topic for sure.
Yeah, it's kind of indicative of how each franchise has had its fortunes over the years. Probably the less fortunate ones have less numbers. I think that will really show. And on the contrary, the ones who have had championship teams, it's beginning to seem like they might even have too many numbers in the Raptors.
Yeah, it's a weird problem to have, and only one team really has, what could even be considered a serious problem there. But there are teams that have retired numbers and later, seemingly were very liberal about how they retired numbers and have become, more stingy as time goes on, probably indicating some regret there. But yeah, so we'll start just a few general things before we get into the actual teams. There apparently is no standard policy in the NBA for how teams should handle retiring a player's jersey. There was a pretty good ESPN article by Adam Reisinger on this, I believe, last fall, and it got into that and delved into a few interesting things. That the number that has been retired most is number 32, which has been retired by 11 teams. 7 of those players are in the Hall of Fame. The ones who are not are Sean Elliott, Rip Hamilton, Brian Winters of the Bucks, and Fred Brown of the Supersonics. And number 23 has been retired by 6 teams in honor of 5 players. And Jordan has been retired with the Bulls, of course, and with the Heat, which is, of course, a little bit more surprising, and we'll delve into that. And there have been 14 players who have had a number retired by 2 teams, and Wilt Chamberlain and Pete Maravich are the only ones who have been retired with 3 franchises. I don't know if it's too shocking, but that's interesting. 2 players for that to happen to. I guess you have to have had a certain balance of, both, of course, being great and being popular and also having played for a lot of teams. And there's relatively few people in NBA history who, can claim to have that.
Yeah, it's almost, I think it's almost tough not to retire Wilt's jersey, even though, his certain stints ended with some sour feelings at the end, and they weren't even all that long, like in the case with Philly. But how can you not retire Wilt, I guess?
Yeah, and of course what he meant to Philly overall beyond, his time with the 76ers and the fact that they were, at the time, the greatest team probably in NBA history, and he's still among that club. I mean, it definitely makes sense that it happened. Just interesting the way that it happened. Yeah, and Maravich, of course, is an even more interesting case, which we'll delve into when we get to the teams that retired his number. But yeah, so that's I guess really the only other player who you could maybe make a case for that. But there isn't really a third team that had enough of him would be Moses Malone. I mean, obviously the Rockets and the Sixers are pretty no brainer, but there's not really. He had some good years with the Bullets and in some decent years with the Hawks, but no one really else that you could say he stood out for enough to merit retiring his number, even though he was obviously a great player who played for a lot of teams.
Well, if the Magic keeps this up, then I think then we certainly have to cross out Shaquille, because he seems like a natural fit. Because
right.
Pat Riley likes to honor his guys, even though he brought a championship there. So I guess that's what makes him a Heat lifer, and that opened the door for that possibility. But it seems like, as we'll get into it later on, that Orlando's not too fond of retiring a number for someone who hasn't won a title for the franchise, and so far there are no titles.
Yes, yeah, a couple close ones, but not close enough, unfortunately. So some teams that have not retired any numbers, they're not too surprisingly, mostly, of course, recent teams that have come into the league in the past, 30 years or so. First, the Toronto Raptors, and I guess the biggest issue is that the great players who have played on their franchise Vince Carter and Chris Bosh. Well, Carter, of course, hasn't even retired yet. And both those guys, left the team amid circumstances that were less than ideal. There were some hard feelings, especially in the case of Carter, being traded away and later admitting that he had, basically sandbagged the, not played as hard as he could have or what have you, which got a lot of negative coverage at the time. Really the only, actual retired player, I think, with sufficient longevity who, the team could even have considered retiring. This would be more along the lines as a cult favorite, would be Morris Peterson. He was there for 7 seasons, including on the 2001 Eastern Conference semifinals team, which was the most successful team they'd had up until the recent DeRozan Lowry teams. But he's really the only one, and that's honestly a relatively strong stretch, I would say.
Yeah, and the fact that he played with Vince, together with Vince, I think that probably makes it seem like Carter will be the first one who has his jersey retired. And I think that the year they had that, was it 20 years that they were celebrating of Raptors basketball, they gave Vince a video tribute. I think that was a sign that the organization is over with it, and it's not like Rob Babcock is a part of the Raptors anymore. And I think the president has changed as well. And whatever vibes you get from that organization or the fans, at least in my experience, it seems like they have mostly forgiven him. And I do think that his accolades allow him to qualify for such an honor, whether he left them in a bad situation or he didn't, because he really is the reason why Canadian NBA basketball was put on the map. And he deserves it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. I think that whatever feelings there were have almost have thawed either completely or at least enough where that's certainly going to happen. Bosh, I don't know. I haven't really heard anything about that. Obviously, the Raptors were generally not particularly a strong team when he was there, even though he performed strong. And I think he's historically going to be much more remembered for his role on the Heat than he is with the Raptors. So that one, I don't know if that one will happen or not. I mean, I even though he was probably even better player than Carter during his time with the franchises, I just don't think he's historically significant enough for the Raptors for that to happen. But it's not like it would be out of bounds if it did happen.
Yeah, and at this point, it almost seems like, and in a way, it's strange to say this because I would say that Bosh is the better player, but that DeMar's a much better candidate. His longevity is already unmatched. He's leading the franchise in games played and points, and he'll probably stay with the team for at least a couple of more years to add to his totals. And I guess this year's postseason could end in something that Bosh didn't ever succeed in with Toronto. He never went past the first round, so it seems like DeRozan might have leaped him already. So yeah, Bosh might end up being the star who was sort of in between the two good eras, and I wouldn't be certain about it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I mean, I agree that I think DeRozan is certainly in line for that eventually on the horizon. Kyle Lowry, I think, as well. I don't know if there's anyone else really on the current iteration of the Raptors where maybe, I mean, if they are able to win a championship, then I think there might be some other players they would consider Valanciunas or guys who were there for like a long time. But I think Lowry and DeRozan are almost definite at this point, given their longevity and given the fact that they've given the team the most success it by far it's ever had.
Yeah, Lowry's a good one because his games might not be there, but I hope that down the line they remember that he gave them a spark, which probably wouldn't have happened unless he had been there, because I'm not certain whether DeMar on his own would have led the team anywhere.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think he was the more important player. At least the first couple of years of that. I mean, I think they're close to equal now. Maybe DeRozan slightly ahead, but I mean, yeah, he really was. I think the most important player of those first couple of years when they kind of got back on track and definitely will deserve that recognition.
Yeah.
So next franchise is the Los Angeles Clippers, of course, formerly the Buffalo Braves. Also spent some years in San Diego as well. Of course, the Clippers are notorious for their lack of success. Really, the only teams that had much success since they've been the Clippers were not counting the Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan era, which we'll get into in a minute. But before that, the 2006 team, which he starred Elton Brand and Corey Maggette, was important as well, and it had some pretty strong longevity for that franchise. I think they would definitely be candidates. Brand definitely being the stronger one. The only issue with Brand probably is that there were some acrimony when he left the franchise. Only other player I would say would be serious contention from the San Diego LA years would be Danny Manning, who was of course the number one pick. He was probably the best player on their 92-93 playoff teams. Injuries held him back from ultimate success, but he still was a very good player. And up until Brand was probably the best player in Clipper history. The stronger cases for retirement, but of course this happened in a different city, so unlikely at this point, would be Randy Smith, who actually did play in San Diego very briefly, but was mostly known as a Buffalo Brave. Consecutive game streak record, and all around a standout. All-Star Game MVP 1 year, very good player. And then Bob McAdoo, who of course won the 1975 MVP for the Braves when they were at their strongest, and is a Hall of Famer. In fact, is the only retired former MVP not to have his number retired by the team, which is kind of surprising. But anyone else that stands out to you in terms of guys who you could say could be considered for that honor?
I don't think so. The latest big three is I think the best possible candidates. As for those pure Clipper guys, it's almost like Donald Sterling has left a stain on the players as well, because I cannot think of Danny Manning, and God bless him, he was a very good player, but I cannot think of him in a Clippers uniform and just sense any positive connotation from that name. And I do think that the franchise probably wants to move forward from that as well. So in a way, it hurts guys like Danny Manning, and I'd make a push for Randy Smith. It's definitely awkward when it's happened in a different city, and at least the team was good then. And then Curtis Harris would probably be more vocal about his case and the fact that AC Green stole the Ironman title from him, and then where it happened by him subbing in games where he played like 2 minutes. But Randy was terrific, and there probably is a place for the marketing people of the Clippers to at least honor him. It's not the same, but there should be some sort of acknowledgement, because the Buffalo Braves 50-year anniversary is coming up in 2020, so I think they have to remember those two guys, him and McAdoo, in some sort of way. Whether it's maybe it could be similar to the Ring of Honor or whatever the Magic called their thing.
Yeah, or like we'll talk about later, but the Lakers retired, and obviously this was a team with much more greater success, but they have a banner for the Minneapolis teams and the Hall of Famers that were on that team. Maybe they could do something similar for the greats of the Braves days, something along those lines maybe. I would agree. I think Randy Smith probably has the strongest, given that longevity there. And McAdoo obviously was still probably the best player that the organization ever had. You could make a case for Chris Paul too, but one thing that's going to be really interesting, of course, is and I think it's likely that both get their jerseys retired, but the fact that Paul and Griffin left, not like in bad terms or anything, but they were both traded away. They both have decent longevity there. 6-7 years or so. So that's plenty, I think, to get it. But it's not like neither one's going to retire there, obviously, unless they go back, which seems unlikely. And then DeAndre Jordan, of course, he's kind of the third of that big three. Who knows how long he'll last? I believe he's a free agent this year, so whether he'll stick around with the team or not. But I obviously, even though they are kind of best known for their playoff disappointments, Rich and I have talked about before about how they're actually, you look at that, 6-year run or so of, there are very, very few teams who have had, regular season success for that length of time, which is certainly something. And given what Clipper history was before then, that's, I think that should be celebrated a little bit more than it really gets.
Oh yeah, and I do think it will be celebrated, because it sort of marks the end of the dark times and the start of a new generation, and then a new time in Clippers franchise history. And probably, I don't know how long will Doc be involved with the Clippers organization, but probably if he does stay for a couple of years, he will have to retire from the Clippers because he's still trading jabs with Chris Paul in the media. There was I don't remember the offer, but there was a recent article on the Rockets and the way they play, and it still managed to find a way in. The ugly breakup between the two of them. But as time passes by, I think it's not as nearly as ugly as the Vince Carter and the Raptors split up, and they managed to mend those relationships. So I don't see why Chris Paul or Blake Griffin couldn't do the same.
Yeah, and it's not like they're necessarily going to likely be retired by another team. I mean, maybe the Pelicans with Chris Paul. We'll get to that obviously, but so I think you're primarily going to think of them as Clippers for their rest of their career. I guess it depends on how things go with Paul and the Rockets, and to a degree, I guess Blake with the Pistons too. If he's there for a long time, maybe that changes the conversation. But at the moment, it's hard. That certainly seems to be like the primary franchise that they're likely to be remembered for in their career, just given the longevity of those teams. But I guess we'll see. Maybe that's more up in the air than now that I think about it. Maybe that's a little bit more up in the air than I was thinking. But nevertheless, that's I think there's a good chance, definitely not 100% chance for either guy.
Yeah, I'd even be a bit more concerned about DeAndre because he could certainly leave this summer, and he's the type of guy who has the longevity and the totals because of his the way he racks up rebounds and points and blocks. But I don't know whether he stands the test of time as time passes by.
Yeah, I mean he was first team All NBA one time at center. I mean he has some pretty strong accolades, and yet you're right in terms of the longevity, not just because he's been there forever, but also because he's played 82 games basically every year, so he's racked up a lot of top tens and various career stats. But yes, obviously he's not to the level of player as Paul and Griffin. But I guess it also depends if he ends up staying there for a long time and then has really the longevity stuff. Then I think certainly at that point he would likely be retired.
Yeah, this summer is probably the breaking point. Yeah.
So next we have the Memphis Grizzlies. Of course, they were in Vancouver originally. Things did not go well in Vancouver. There's probably that whole era is probably best forgotten. The only really player from that era that you would even think could even merit even a thought on that is Sharif Abdul-Rahim, who was very good. But there's nothing, no team success there really. Nothing that really no legacy to speak of there. He just happens to be kind of the best player out of those years. But there's several guys, of course, who are on the horizon, and they've already announced that they are going to retire Zach Randolph and Tony Allen's numbers, which obviously seem very appropriate. Those are the two guys who really helped define the culture there in the late 2000s, early 2010s that has kind of made them very popular in the city when they had not had very much success in their first decade in the league. Did have some playoff teams early on in Memphis. And I would say that Marc Gasol and Mike Conley are even better players and of course will have longer longevity and are even more likely to have their numbers retired. I think one player who is really interesting is Pau Gasol because the fact that he has in some ways his run was even you could consider him maybe the best player in franchise histories in terms of just being. No player was better at their peak than he was when he was there. You could maybe make a case for Gasol or Conley, Marc Gasol or Conley, but I think Pau probably, at his very best was the best Memphis Grizzly. But the way that he left the team, I could see it kind of being something similar with Spencer Haywood in Seattle, where he was like the first star for that franchise in that place. But left kind of in acrimonious terms, and may not get the honor, but I'm not 100% sure about that. The other thing about Gasol is that, of course, because the Lakers won the championships, he's going to be better remembered as a Laker than he will as a Grizzly.
Yeah, and it's too bad because when you think of his name, first round exits with Hubie Brown sort of come to mind, which isn't helpful. But he also had years where guys you never heard of logged hundreds of minutes. I'm sorry, but Terrence Kinsey, Lawrence Roberts, I almost know those names just because we weren't meant to know them. That's how they have stuck in my memory. And it certainly wasn't Paul's fault. And I think they could do something nice where they perhaps they don't retire his number initially, but they wait until Mark ends his career and then do a night for both of them. Because Pau obviously had a bigger impact on the city than the results show. For one, Mark went to high school in Memphis just because Pau was his older brother who was playing there with the Grizzlies. So I think he should get in. I'm not certain whether it will happen, but I do agree that he probably is the best overall player. And then some of those seasons he put together in his prime, I don't think any other Grizzly has sort of surpassed that. I think they more so did that as a unit than more so than individually.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just took note that they had not. That the Grizzlies had not used Pau's number 16 until last season when Tony Douglas had it.
Okay.
So that's interesting that they kept it out of circulation for that long, but then they used it for Tony Douglas. Of course, that year that was the year where they had like 25 guys on the roster because of all the horrific injuries they had. So I believe that was last year. So they may have needed it at that point after having so many guys out, but. But yeah, so I don't know if that means anything or not, but it's interesting that because a lot of times we'll see the number is, even if it's not officially retired, it's taken out of circulation with maybe the intention to retire, or there's maybe just the intention just to not invite comparisons with the newer player for a certain amount of time. But yeah, that's interesting. I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah, and another thing that might determine this is the fact that it's possible. I don't know when the date is coming up, but it's possible for the minority owners to buy Para out, and sometimes the new ownerships drive some narratives, and perhaps if stuff changes in Memphis, perhaps they want to make it seem like we're about history. We want to cherish guys like Pau, and maybe the opposite happens, and they don't remember him. So that might also influence the way things end up.
Yeah, for sure. Next we have so those are all the teams that have no numbers retired. Now we have one number retired. The Charlotte Hornets, who retired Bobby Phills, who died in January 2000 when he was in a Porsche that spun out of control and collided with another vehicle, and this was moments after he left a morning practice at the Charlotte practice facility, so very near to where other players were. We'll get into the details on that in a moment, but yeah, he was only 30 years old. He'd spent 3 seasons with the Hornets, and yeah, actually his teammates were there with club officials immediately after the accident, because it occurred less than a mile from Charlotte Coliseum. They had a game scheduled that night, but it was postponed. Obviously, and he was 6 months later. His teammate David Wesley was convicted of reckless driving, but acquitted of racing charges. And Phil's was he was a good player. He went kind of from a 10-day contract into a 9-year career, and was called by Michael Jordan to be the toughest defender he'd ever faced, and had a career 3-point percentage of 39%, so a very good 3-point per shooter, low volume, but probably that part of his game would have aged very well in this era. And so his jersey was retired about a month later, February 9th, 2000, in a game against the Cavaliers, his former team. And another interesting thing is that his number actually remained with the original Hornets franchise when they moved to New Orleans, and when they transferred the Hornets name as they became the Pelicans and the Bobcats became the Hornets. The new Hornets raised number 13 to the rafters in 2014, and when in New Orleans, they actually put the number 13 jersey in their practice facility and not in the Smoothie King Center. The Phil's actually had ties to Louisiana as well. I think he was from Baton Rouge or went to school in Baton Rouge, but so there was a connection there. But that's obviously that's an odd one to have happen, of course, with the circumstances of why they retired his jersey and having, of course, moving cities a couple of years later. But that's not quite unique situation, because a couple of other instances it's happened, but it's certainly that's sort of a hard one to handle. Like it's nice that the new Hornets team took that history and brought the banner back to Charlotte.
Yeah, and again, similarly to what I said about Memphis, I think it probably shows something that the Michael Jordan's Hornets wanted to make a point by bringing the jersey back, because obviously it was George Sinn back then who put it up, who owned the team during the tragedy, and and in this case, I guess that's a testament to Bobby Phill's character. You know, the fact that it was even retired, and yeah, that's a message that Hornets organization wants to put across, that they respect the memory of him.
Yeah, and there have been a few players, I would say, in Hornets Bobcats history who you would like no slam dunk absolute candidate, but you look at Gerald Wallace, who was probably definitely the standout Bobcat. Larry Johnson, Glenn Rice, Alonzo Mourning, all of course had successful but relatively short stints with the franchise. Of course, Muggsy Bogues, probably the best known Hornet, the long term Hornet of franchise history. The ending there went pretty badly with him in the franchise, so maybe that's the reason it didn't get retired at that time. And probably when the team, of course, transitioned cities, there was less of a incentive to retire his jersey, and then maybe that just kind of got lost in the shuffle. But that seems like an obvious one. Anyone else that would stand out to you, or what do you think of the cases of of kind of those guys?
Yeah, since I have written for At the Hive and I have followed the Horncats extensively during these last years, I would like to see Gerald Wallace's jersey retired, because it's a case where it wasn't the player's fault that the team stunk, and he certainly gave it all he had, and it was almost like the league's best secret during those years in between 2010 and 2007, where you might see him on some top tens, but Wallace was among the most entertaining players in the NBA due to his hustle and willingness to give up his body, and in kind of similar ways like the other guys you mentioned, the divorce was kind of sad, and Gerald certainly wasn't happy about the way things ended, and I would hope that the franchise patches things up with him, but on the other hand, I cannot imagine it happening, because he's sort of during that Bobcats age, and I'm not certain whether they ever want anything affiliated with that name to be brought back, and I'm not too thrilled about some of the other guys, just because I sort of value longevity over short time success, but I'd almost rather make a case for Muggsy Bogues or Odell Curry than someone like LJ or Alonzo, because it seems like the franchise is waiting to retire the jersey of a real all-star who sticks with Charlotte, and Kemba will probably become the one, but I think Muggsy and Dell also deserve it, due to the fact that they have hung around, and Dell's announced games for quite some seasons now, and then just was passed in overall points scored just the other day by Kemba.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's definitely going to likely to be the one in the future. He's already had enough time there where, assuming there's not a bad ending with him and the Hornets like there have been with a lot of other guys, I think that's a strong case for that. Yeah, it'd be nice to see Gerald Wallace. I mean, he was an excellent player. I mean, he wasn't obviously the star on especially that Larry Johnson and Mourning were, but yeah, he definitely was a very good player for that franchise. So next we have the Timberwolves and their retired numbers, similar circumstances. Malik Sealy, who died in May of 2000 in a car crash. He had 2 seasons with the Wolves. He'd also played with the Pacers, Clippers, and Pistons in his career, and he died after he had attended a birthday party for Kevin Garnett and was killed by a drunk driver on the way home. And he was off the court. He was known as an entrepreneur. His mother taught him how to sew when he was in 5th grade, and he also founded his own company that designed ties and clothing, and was also involved in acting. It appeared on TV shows including Diagnosis Murder and the basketball movie Eddie. And his father was a bodyguard for Malcolm X. That's how he got the name Malik. So. The Timberwolves are another team where they of course relatively new, and they have not had a lot of great periods of success. Obviously, the player who deserves his jersey retired the most is Kevin Garnett. The fact that hasn't happened is apparently relationship issues with Glenn Taylor, the owner, for what seemed like various reasons, including him Garnett not feeling like the team paid the proper tribute to Flip Saunders after he passed away. So obviously I feel like that probably will happen at some point. but that's sort of the interesting one. In terms of guys who are on the horizon, it's a little bit too soon to tell, obviously, but there's the core guys now of Karl Anthony Towns, Andrew Wiggins, and Jimmy Butler seem like they're candidates depending on the success of the team. And then the only other player really I think that would stand out to be good enough, although he was very good in years that the team was very bad, would be Kevin Love.
Yeah, and I think that Garnett will probably make amends with ownership at some point, but yeah, Flip Saunders is an interesting one because we'll see later later in the podcast that other teams certainly do retire signature coaches, and then as we just heard about Malik Sealy and then Bobby Phil's, a franchise could certainly make a move once person has passed away, and they retire his number to commemorate his memory, and they definitely had an opportunity to do that with Flip and put up his initials or whatever they felt like was the proper way to pay tribute, and it hasn't happened, and the longer the time passes, it will only get more awkward. So I wonder what happens there, because he certainly has the totals and the number of seasons which make him pretty much a Timberwolves lifer.
Yeah, absolutely. And Flip would be an excellent choice too. I hadn't thought of that one for some reason, but he would be good as well. It'd be interesting to see. We would think Garnett would be. They would love to do that, but I guess it depends on how things go with the relationship. Next, we have the New Orleans Pelicans, who retired Pete Maravich's number. Of course, did not play for the Hornets Pelicans franchise because it did not exist when he was in the league. But his jersey was retired in 2002 when the Hornets moved to New Orleans. His jersey was also retired by the Louisiana Superdome in 1988. Probably after he passed away. And obviously he was one of the great college scorers of all time at LSU and a signature star for the Jazz when they were in New Orleans. Something that's sort of interesting is that his jersey was actually taken down when the Smoothie King Center underwent renovations, which this is from an April 2014 column in the Times-Picayune. And I guess actually the Bobby Phil's banner came down as well. So maybe the Bobby, we said about the practice in the Smoothie King Center, maybe it was up there after it was taken down in the arena. But either way, and also Maravich's streamer on the Superdome Wall of Fame, along with a bunch of Saints, were taken down, which was replaced by a new Saints Ring of Honor. So right now he doesn't actually have a tribute in the arena. Perhaps it's hung up in the practice facility like it was for Bobby Phil's, but and there's a Pelicans and Saints public relations quote says that there are plans to include him there, and there's architectural renderings already in place, and there's a plan to include other greats in professional basketball in New Orleans and Louisiana that also include Bob Pettit. I've been to the Smoothie King Center. I know they did have some sort of displays there, like on the outside, and Pettit was among those. Maravich probably was too. I don't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, it's a little bit odd that they didn't hang it back up. Maybe it was just one of those things where because he didn't play for the franchise, they wanted to honor him in some other way. And it's not like he's hurting for recognition, but it does definitely seem like New Orleans is the place where his certainly his NBA and maybe his basketball legacy belongs the most.
Yeah, definitely, and I like the city rather than the team connection. For example, if Buffalo had a team all of a sudden for whatever reason, it probably won't happen. But I'd be all for a Bob McAdoo and a Randy Smith jersey there. So I do hope they bring Maravich back because sometimes it just makes more sense, and the way franchises move, it definitely there's definitely less continuity there. So if a player belongs to a city, I'm all for it.
In terms of other omissions, there's a couple of guys who sort of, because of the move from Charlotte to New Orleans, who kind of get split in history, like P.J. Brown. He had 2 years in Charlotte and then 4 years in New Orleans. One of those were in both New Orleans and OKC when they were briefly in Oklahoma City after the hurricane. And then Baron Davis, who had 3 seasons in Charlotte and 2.5 seasons in New Orleans. And I would say Baron maybe has the stronger case. Neither guy particularly is, a huge standout. The team was not hugely successful during that time or anything, but it's sort of interesting that it sort of takes away from any longevity argument that they have because of splitting that up. Guys who on the horizon who you could see getting their jerseys retired. Anthony Davis, of course, who's playing there right now, is I think he's already probably done enough to merit it. It would depend, maybe on. If things ended badly, maybe it wouldn't happen. But other than that, I think he's basically done enough there. Chris Paul, of course, who began his career there and had a lot of great years. That one, I guess you could kind of go either way depending on how the feelings were at the end there. And then the other guy would be David West, who obviously wasn't as great as those players, but was kind of the heart and soul for the those couple years that the Hornets were with Paul were pretty strong team, challenging the Spurs in the playoffs and so forth.
Yeah, I hope that Paul is a no-brainer for them. At least I think he should be. And David West will probably be hurt by that stretch because he played 8 years with the franchise, 2 All-Star appearances. But I looked at the attendance numbers, and 5 years out of those 8, the team was 25th or lower in attendance. And Katrina happens right in the middle of that, and I think it really hurts those teams in regards to their local recognition because there were simply more serious concerns at hand. And I wonder what type of connection does the average, New Orleans citizen feels with David West? Because I would guess that there is probably a little one. Although in other cases he might get his jersey retired if it was for any other franchise.
Yeah, it's a little bit like. I think he's a better player, but he's a little bit like Tony Allen in Memphis. Only, Tony Allen was so embraced by the fans of Memphis, and David West, the Pelicans fans didn't have that same sort of level of support for the team. Understandable given the circumstances, but so you could see him kind of going in as a cult favorite like that, but because he doesn't necessarily have that same level of recognition in terms of the community, then that seems obviously less likely.
Yeah, and it's even more awkward when you think about it because today's fans are they should be called Pelicans fans, and yet David West played for the Hornets, which those are basically the Hornets years where you sort of when you hear the Hornets you think of Charlotte, but they had some seasons in New Orleans, and then that's a stretch that probably will be forgotten in New Orleans basketball. Besides Chris Paul, because I hope that he gets his due.
Yeah, you would think so. I mean, I guess again the acrimony over him leaving would be the only reason I would think that there would be any likelihood it wouldn't happen. But you never know. It's with these teams who haven't really retired numbers, it's hard to judge what they will do. And obviously, different front offices, different ownership, etc. They all have different criteria anyway. So
yeah, they can certainly make the move where they set the tempo by just retiring Anthony Davis first and just basically sending across the message that they are forgetting about the Hornets days, which is I think it's a possibility in some small way.
Yeah, well, if Anthony Davis is there for his career or what have you, they may want to just save it and give him the honor of it being first, and then honor Paul later or whatever. That's a possibility too. I guess we'll see how that goes. So yeah, next the sort of a strange one you talked about a little bit before, Orlando Magic, who have retired number 6 for the fans, considering the fans the sixth man. Otherwise, have not retired any jerseys. Patrick Ewing did wear the number 6 after the jersey was retired. So in 2002, he's the only player to have worn 6 for the Magic. Now, the Magic say that they do have a criteria for retiring a jersey. They have not publicly revealed that, and only saying that no one has met it yet. It's assumed that winning a championship is the prerequisite for that, and obviously they have not won a championship. There is an Orlando Magic Hall of Fame. Tracy McGrady was recently inducted into it. It also includes Pat Williams and Jimmy Hewitt, who are the team co-founders, Nick Anderson, Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway, and owner Rich DeVos. Do you have any feelings about approaching it this way as opposed to a number retirement?
I really don't know. But, I guess it's cool to return back to see faces you haven't seen, have your moment. But teams also hold reunions for title teams or significant cores, and I sort of don't see how that differs from this then, because almost anyone who has ever been on a significant team for that particular city has had the chance to go back for a reunion and sort of have his own night. And I guess the difference might be that it isn't yours personally, that it is more so for the team. But still, I see what they are doing, but I think a number in the Raptors is something that's always there, something that you can always see when you step in the arena, and that to me seems like much more. And then it feels a bit of a cop out, but I think we'll see with teams further down the line that it might be a good idea to sort of not get carried away with it. So maybe they're doing something right, and I'm not seeing the full picture, but I don't really like it.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, yeah, they can do whatever they want. Obviously, I don't know. There's something about it that just feels like, oh, we're special, oh, we're different, we're gonna do it this way, and it just seems like the reason it seems a little bit nonsensical to do it that way. But I also get the other problem is, like other teams we've talked about, the guys who, would be in there, Tracy McGrady, Penny Hardaway, Shaquille O'Neal, and maybe Nick Anderson, all those guys, were great players for a short time who left because Nick Anderson being the exception, he was there for a long time. But, Shaq, Penny, and McGrady all were there relatively short periods of time. McGrady and Hardaway both had the same number one. That makes a huge difference. But, the fact is that, and those guys all kind of left under not the best circumstances. So, I guess doing it that way, I mean, they're honoring guys, which is good. I don't know, putting the owners in there seems sort of, I don't know, self-congratulatory or what have you. But, and I'm not the biggest fan of the DeVos family, so maybe that adds to it a little bit for me. But, nevertheless, yeah, I mean, I like I said, I wouldn't say it's wrong. It just feels like unnecessary, I guess. But it's not my team, so what can you do? Magic fans don't seem to have a huge problem with it. From what I've gathered on the internet, they don't seem. I mean, like I said, they're honoring their players. It's good enough that you can go to the Hall of Fame. So that's something. I don't know. Of course, I don't think there's any big omissions from that Hall of Fame. Maybe you could see like a Darryl Armstrong or Dennis Scott going in at some point, and then the guys who are later going to be interesting is the 2009 title team. Rashard Lewis, Hito Turkoglu are both, of course, retired now. I could see them definitely being honored that way. Jameer Nelson, I would imagine, given his longevity with the franchise. And then, the tricky one, and I assume he'll be honored, will be Dwight Howard.
Yeah, and I'd actually be a bit hurt if I was Dennis Scott, because I feel like that's the four. If you include Nick Anderson, then I feel like you have to mention Dennis Scott as well. Perhaps it's in the workings and it happens in the future, but I feel like he has to be. And we're now debating about a Orlando Magic Hall of Fame, which is another step down. But I feel like he has to be there. At least that's my opinion about it.
Yeah. He left in under not the best circumstances either, but
so many burned bridges.
Yes. So, well, I honestly, I guess, not just with the Magic, but with all these teams, I guess it has been, which I guess is why they've not retired the main numbers, is because it's gone poorly. So, so now we're getting to franchises that have retired a few numbers. The Mavericks, Derrick Harper, Brad Davis, and Rolando Blackman. And Derrick Harper was retired just in January of 2018, so fairly recently. It actually seems sort of odd that they waited that long to do it. I couldn't find whether there was a story behind why they took that long, but they did. And it was a little bit of a surprise to me when I first looked into this. Brad Davis, the fact that his number had been retired, and the fact that it was the first number retired in Mavericks history. He had career averages of 8.2 points and 4.9 assists. He was never an all-star, and in fact, in the last 6 years of his career, all with the Mavericks, he didn't even average more than 20 minutes per game. So was a reserve for the second half of his career. But he was the final Maverick remaining from the team's first season in 80-81, so he had a lot of longevity with the franchise and has had a role with the team, pretty much ever since. He was assistant coach for a while and has been a TV or radio commentator for the Mavs. So he's certainly lasted with the franchise, but it's the fact that they retired his number and the fact that they were in such a rush to retire his number after he retired is just sort of interesting, given the circumstances.
Yeah, and it's a real contrast to it's basically a lifetime recognition one. the one which Del Curry, for example, hasn't received in Charlotte, and I think Del Curry is a much better player, and he also has commentated and stayed with the team, and in a way, more power to the Mavs organization. If they felt like Brad Davis had been such part of their culture and their team, so be it. As I said, I like the longevity ones, and I guess this is where my stance on these things show. Because, but yeah, on the other hand, it's certainly odd that Derek Harper had to wait for so long for his jersey to be retired, because if you look at their totals, he played 11 games fewer than Brad, so he's also a Mavs lifer. Yet he scored almost 5,000 points more. So I don't really get the math behind that, and I certainly haven't heard anything bad about Derek Harper as far as his character or whatever was concerned during his time with Dallas. So I don't know. Maybe there's something behind the scenes there, but it's very odd. It almost, when it happens in 2018, you almost wonder why it took so long, and whether there was a chance that it wouldn't have happened at all.
Yeah, it's a little surprising. Yeah, and Rolando Blackman wasn't until 2000, although that was not that long after he retired. I mean, I think he was mid to late 90s, I believe he retired. So that seems like a reasonable time frame. But in terms of omissions, some real interesting ones. Mark Aguirre, who was a really standout scorer for the Mavericks during the 80s, led them to some fairly good playoff success, including the 88 Western Conference Finals. Had a fallout with Dick Motta and traded to the Pistons in '89, and that was probably similar to a Vince Carter situation where there was a lot of sulking and there was a lot of, almost sandbagging the team kind of thing before he got traded. And also, he was a no-show at Derek Harper's retirement ceremony, and he was scheduled to be one of the 4 speakers to speak there, and then he was a no-show, and then Brad Davis actually subbed in as a speaker. So there was a report from Sports Day from Dallas News where none of the Mavericks employees knew had heard from him, knew why he wasn't there, and several expressed disappointment in him, and so that may have something to do with the fact that why his number hasn't been retired yet if he can't make that ceremony. But he's definitely there probably are some those types of behind the scene reasons behind him not being. The only other thing is that of course winning the championship with the Pistons, he's probably, even though he wasn't there for that long, he's probably more tied in people's minds to the Pistons and winning the championship there than he is to the Mavericks, despite being one of the better players in their history.
Yeah, and I thought I really figured that they had mended their relationship. I remember that they were doing these roundtables like 5 or 6 years ago, and I looked the Mavs one up as we were talking, and I remember Run TMC came together, if I remember correctly, and the same happened with the late 80s Mavericks, and Mark Aguirre was present for that one, so I figured that their relationship is okay, because it's certainly one of those situations where the players weren't holding anything back, and during the years, everyone who was with the Mavs back then, they certainly spoke out how Mark became an irritant during those later years, and the year he was traded, and that he wasn't happy to be there. So it's probably something that was ugly behind the scenes back then, and I think they still can't get over it. At least it appears so. If he really stood them up and didn't arrive at Derrick's jersey retirement.
Yeah. Two others that kind of stand out. Michael Finley, who didn't really occur to me until later on, but absolutely was really after those terrible years in the 90s for the Mavericks, he was really helped start them back on a path to respectability. Of course, Dirk and Nash being a big part of that as well, but he was really the better player of those three for a while, and really helped lead them into great success as they both developed. And Jason Kidd, of course, had 2 stints with the Mavs, was part of their championship team in 2011. And I do remember from when Kidd left the Mavs for the Knicks in free agency in 2012, Cuban was angry. He Cuban even said, I'm sure I'll get over it at some point, but as of right now, I wouldn't put J Kidd's number in the rafters. So he was very upset about the situation at the time. I don't know if that's really changed. Kid obviously got his jersey retired by the Nets, which we'll get to in a little bit. So maybe there's, and he got fired from the Bucks, obviously, but he's been active coach, pretty much since he left the league. So maybe you don't want the optics of retiring a number of an opposite coach, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's I would say that he certainly seems deserving as one of the great players in their history.
Yeah, and I think I had the same reaction to Finley's name as you had, because I noticed him, and then this is where context almost changes my perspective, because I was waving the Gerald Wallace flag for the Bobcats or the Hornets, and it made sense to me. And here we have Blackman and Harper with Nowitzki coming up, and it's almost like Finley, you weren't that important to the Dallas Mavericks, and the standard has been set, right? And while those years for Michael Finley are probably up to par with Wallace's contributions, if not even more important, it's just not the same thing when you're playing for the Dallas Mavericks. And I guess this is the cutoff point where we can sort of see how things change with time, and then the context really matters, because some lesser players can get retired with other teams, and then someone might have a good stint, and then in the end he doesn't seem all that sexy of a choice.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he was obviously, and I think it's partly because the post Finley and Nash Mavs were even better. With Derrick, they obviously won the championship in 2011, and they had some really strong seasons before that. So while the Mavericks had never had the kind of success that they had at that point in the early 2000s, they exceeded it later, and so you kind of got lost in that shuffle. Even though, like I said, he was a really important player at that time. I think he was an All-Star at least a couple times. So, was very successful there. In terms of, on the horizon, obviously, they'll retire Dirk Nowitzki's number as soon as they probably can. And it'll be interesting to see which other players from the 2011 team get their jersey retired. I think Jason Terry is very likely, given his longevity in Dallas. Other possibilities, Sean Marion, who actually was in Dallas for 5 years, was a really important part of that team. Tyson Chandler, who was actually he was there in 2011 and then he came back for a season later. So I think that's less likely, but I would say, given his importance to that team, it's not out of the realm of possibility. And then JJ Barea, who, of course, who's was also very important and also left and came back. So he's had enough longevity with the franchise. Again, I think Chandler and Barea are outside chances. I don't think Marion's super likely either, although I think the case is strong there given longevity of him playing there, even though obviously we mostly think of him, I think, playing with the Suns, but he had a lot of longevity with Mavericks as well. And then, I guess Steve Nash, he has a similar thing as Finley, although he obviously, is a Hall of Famer and had MVPs and all that, but that happened with a different franchise. So I don't think it's super likely either, although I believe he still has a close relationship with Cuban, so maybe there's a possibility there. But yeah, I don't know. What do you outside of Dirk? What do you think of the rest of those guys?
It seems like Terry played 3 more seasons with Dallas than Finley did, and it is not true. But the title and the cult status of a sixth man, I think it makes Terry seem like an easy choice to make. Plus, he was, he made some of the big shots in the Miami series, so I think he'll get in. Not really certain about the other guys, and if you think about it, JJ Barea is almost like the modern I'm blanking on the name already. The modern Brad Davis, who's in a way so forgettable that I forgot about him like 5 minutes after. But yeah, he has a title to his name, and as we'll see with certain other teams, JJ Barea would definitely get his number retired with them, just due to the fact that he was around for so long that he won a championship. And I think that will be the most interesting thing to see how Cuban handles that one if he's still around, because he's the crowd favorite who wasn't a good enough player, but has everything else in order for him to be considered.
So next we have the Wizards Bullets franchise, and they have retired 4 numbers. Actually, I'm sorry, 5 numbers as of this, because Phil Chenier has retired in March 23rd. So Phil Chenier is 45, Earl Monroe number 10, Elvin Hayes number 11, Gus Johnson 25, and Wes Unseld number 41. Also worth noting that the Wizards have actually never issued 23 since Michael Jordan retired in 2003. So that's interesting, given the breakup there. For whatever reason, it was really hard to pin down the retirement dates for the Wizards. They're pretty available for most of the franchises, but they were a little bit trickier to get for the Wizards. But Unseld was retired on November 3rd, 1981. It was the home opener for the franchise a season after he retired. And then Elvin Hayes was 17 days later, which was in a Rockets-Bullets game, and that was after he had gone back to Houston to play for the Rockets for the remainder of his career. Obviously, that was the breakup of the Hayes-Unseld team that went to a bunch of finals and won the championship in '78. And then Gus Johnson's was retired in 1986, and Earl Monroe was retired in I'm actually not 100% sure. It was either December of 07 or December of 08 here, but either way, it was retired around that time. He is maybe slightly surprising given that he was only there for 4 years and left the franchise with very bad feelings. But of course, he's also Hall of Famer, and it makes sense that helped lead them to the finals along with Unseld in '71. So it's not that surprising, but maybe a little bit. Given the fact they've retired to a few numbers, there isn't really a huge surprise here.
Yeah, and I believe we have our first, if I didn't skip out on anyone, I believe we have our first player who actually went back to his old team, as did Elvin Hayes, where he played 2 additional times at Washington after the initial game in which his number was retired. So that makes up for 3 games, and he played in an arena which had his number retired because as we had the story about Zebo and Tony Allen, Memphis will only retire theirs after they end their career. So it's interesting sort of how franchises sort of make these decisions about the timing of it. And although, I think he's the first one, right? We didn't have anyone who had his during his career.
We will.
At this point.
At this point, this is the first one actually, active. That's fairly rare. It's happened a few times here and there. We'll have to count and see who else did it, because I can't think of too many off the top of my head for sure. Let's see. In terms of omissions, I mean, it's interesting because you look at someone like Walt Bellamy, who had some very strong years in the very early years of the franchise, but that was even to a degree in Chicago for the first 2 years with the Packers and the Zephyrs, and then a couple years with the Bullets. They had one strong playoff run. I think it was 65 or 66. And Bobby Dandridge, who didn't have a lot of longevity in Washington, but was a very significant part of those 2 finals teams, the championship team in '78 and '79. And the only other player who, based on their play, would merit it, but is probably not going to, would be Gilbert Reinis. That he was absolutely the star that made the Wizards relevant in the late 2000s, along with Anton Jameson and Caron Butler. One of the two of them, maybe I could see, but obviously Reinis with the incident with the guns in the locker room. I'm sure they're not going to be touching him anytime soon.
Yeah, and it's tough because again the standard has been set. It's very tough to surpass Unseld's or Hayes' longevity and success. And shout out to our friend Adam Cribley, who made a good argument that the Bullets might have been the team of the '70s. And how do you even come after that? Because Gilbert Arenas' name, again, all due respect to his time in Washington, it almost seems like he doesn't deserve to be up there due to the fact how what do you think of those previous names? Although I guess in a way his time could be somewhat compared to Earl Monroe's, a flash in the pan. Not that the guys didn't have consistent seasons, but it was like 3 or 4 years that they really had it together in Washington, and sort of ended in ugly terms, much more ugly in regards to Gilbert. But it's just tough to imagine his jersey up there, right by those guys.
Yeah. In terms of guys, who are on the horizon, you like John Wall, I think, is obviously the leading contender, in terms of, he's already had pretty significant longevity there, lots of all-star appearances. They've gone fairly deep in the playoffs and have had, good success, not, obviously tremendous success, but good success. Bradley Beal, another guy who, might have a case after a few years, and a guy who I think is unlikely, but in terms of maybe being a cult favorite would be Marcin Gortat, just because, those are the kind of the three mainstays that have, been there since they've been, a solid, 50-ish win team over the last few years.
Yeah, well, definitely gets there. I think that one's pretty obvious, and it's up to Bradley Beal to sort of hang around because he also has the makings of someone who could be a lifer who gets recognized after the years pass by.
Right. Yeah. I mean, given the fact that the Wizards haven't really retired, cult favorites, so you pretty much have to be a Hall of Famer. It seems like to get your name retired there.
Yeah.
So next we have the Indiana Pacers. They have retired 5 player numbers and then also owner Mel Simon in 2009. George McGinnis, Reggie Miller, Mel Daniels, Roger Brown, and Slick Leonard. They retired 529 for the number of wins he had with the franchise. And they actually retired McGinnis, Daniels, and Brown all on November 2nd, 1985. And we'll get to a little bit more on that in just a moment. Not really anybody who has been retired. No surprises in terms of that because, like I said, they haven't retired any that many players, and all of them are, of course, among the all-time greats in franchise history. No stragglers there for sure.
Yeah, the moment I saw those names, it made sense, and I instantly thought of Freddie Lewis, and then the story you will bring up will explain a lot. But I think there's the ones that are up there, it makes total sense, and it doesn't seem like there are that many candidates left.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Monteith wrote about Freddie Lewis, where mentioning he's had 3-time All-Star, 3 titles, and 4 finals appearances. He was also was the MVP of the 1972 playoffs and was the captain of those Pacers teams. And when the Pacers decided to retire the numbers, they sent a questionnaire out to local media. They were asked to list their top 3 choices, which basically guaranteed that there would only be 3 chosen. And Lewis was the 4th guy on that list, which is true, but he deserved it nearly as much as those guys did. So the Pacers never went back and honored him, and he's kind of been left off the history despite that. The other guy from those teams who would have a passing chance to be Bob Pettit, who was a 4-time All-Star but was obviously less important than those guys and probably not quite as deserving of those accolades, although certainly wouldn't be wrong to retire him either.
Yeah, and then he's the other name I thought of, and Lewis has Freddie Lewis has the game and those accolades, and I think it was an unfortunate case because I think his number should be up there, and I think Bob also has a case because he obviously was a terrific player also, but he has the Indiana connection. He gave up chances to go to other places. I think there was a story in Loose Balls where was it Dick Tinkham at the time who the general manager basically had noticed that his contract ran out, and Nedelicki could have had his agent calling everyone up and looking for alternatives, but he wanted to stay in Indiana, and they sort of agreed on a new contract, and he was on those championship teams, and to this day he's still working to keep the ABA and the Pacers memories alive by being involved in events and then organizations that not only celebrate the league but help players in need, and I think he should get the city connection points to be worthy of the honor. I think all of that package together makes him a worthy candidate, and I do hope for his sake that that makes it enough for his name to be up there.
Oh yeah, it'd be very nice if if that honor were given to him for sure. That would he definitely would merit it for sure. In terms of the 90s teams, I think other than Reggie Miller, of course, Rick Smits, he is the team's second all-time leading scorer and rebounder and second in games played. The Pacers made it to the conference finals 4 times and the NBA finals once during his time. He's not a slam dunk, but it's certainly not a bad case. You could look at Mark Jackson or Dale Davis as well, kind of lesser cases, but were good players for those teams. In the 2000s, I thought of somebody like Danny Granger, but his longevity was not as much strong as I had remembered. But Jermaine O'Neal, was a 6-time All-Star for the team. Was I think 3rd in MVP one year. It was kind of a weird year, but still, he was a really important player for the franchise, and they had some very good teams in the early 2000s. So. he's kind of a surprise to me. I would say, of the remaining guys on this list, I think he would, he would merit strong recognition. That's kind of an odd one.
Yeah, I hope that the malice at the palace doesn't dock him points because it would be very unfortunate that one night ruined it for him. But I do believe that it could be a chance. The Pacers certainly don't want to bring up memories from that time, and I find it intriguing how Rick Smits could be the best choice because when I thought about it, I didn't think much of his candidacy. But then you look at his career numbers, and he was around for the whole 90s decade, and I think he was drafted like in the late 80s, and I almost feel like if he would be a brash Charles Oakley type, that maybe we would feel differently because he was basically a 7'3" guy who pops for mid-range jumpers and then isn't outwardly emotional, and although he probably spent as much energy in that jersey as any other center, he just doesn't strike you as someone who was this guy who gave it all, but he probably did, and it's just that it happened in a different fashion, and I don't want to use the word, but it probably was a bit boring, and it doesn't conjure up an image of a player who gets his jersey retired.
Yeah, right. That's a good point. I think that certainly plays into the feelings that I'm sure Pacers fans have good feelings about Rick Smits, but is not quite certainly hasn't been quite enough to merit a jersey retirement. At least the team hasn't been forced to do it or anything like that. So. So the next is the Miami Heat, who one of the more wackier franchises in terms of jersey retirements. So they've retired 5 numbers: Tim Hardaway, Dan Marino, we'll get to in a moment, Michael Jordan, Shaquille O'Neal, and Alonzo Mourning. And so even though Marino's number 13 is up in the rafters, and they had a ceremony to retire the jersey. They have actually issued his number 13 to 4 different players since 2005, including Shabazz Napier recently. So it's not as though it's retired using air quotes, but it's not retired in the same way as those other guys. Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing to do. Obviously, it's a different sport, but I get that Marino is obviously like an important Miami icon, and if you want to put his number up there on a banner, I mean, I don't think that's weird. The weirder one to me is Michael Jordan. It was retired. It was like Jordan's fourth to last game in 2003 that it was retired. It was a nice little moment with Pat Riley, giving a little speech and saying, in honor of your greatness and for all you've done for the game of basketball, we want to honor you tonight and hang your jersey from the Raptors. No one will ever wear number 23 for the Miami Heat. You're the best. Which it's a nice thing to do. It just seems like. I don't know. It just seems like it's obviously like something that we tease about here and there of the Heat doing, and I don't know. Michael Jordan, has a strong argument for being the greatest player ever, but there are other players. Why not retire 6 for Bill Russell or that kind of thing. You get to that point, and it's kind of like, okay, it just seems like a goofy thing to do.
Yeah, the thing that it doesn't really bother me, but if I would have an opinion about it, it's that it's almost like a Pat Riley Hall of Fame or a Pat Riley retired jerseys collection, because it certainly, I think you more so think of his name than the Heat franchise when you look at those names, and it seems like he just had all the input, and it was his word who goes up there, and I don't know how it will look like in 30 years when people won't perhaps know about Riley's connection to Jordan, but it is what it is, and I guess the fact that he brought Miami those championships, I guess it gives him an allowance to do whatever he wants because he's Pat Riley.
Yeah, he's Pat Riley.
Yeah.
What can you say? Yes. So the actual first Heat player to get their jersey retired was Alonzo Mourning in 2009. In terms of omissions, I don't think there are any egregious ones. I mean, there's a couple guys you could argue, like Glenn Rice, Eddie Jones, maybe Ronnie Cycli, but no one out there really, like a super strong case. Anyone else that stands out to you?
Yeah, not really, because in a way I didn't even strongly consider someone like Cycli, just because this list is so Riley-like that you only celebrate greatness and the greatest in the sport, and I don't even think that those guys have a shot, unfortunately.
Yeah. So on the horizon, obviously Dwayne Wade at some point will get his jersey retired. LeBron James, no one has worn number 6 since he left Miami. Same with Chris Bosh, no one's worn number 1 since he left. I think those are pretty much no-brainers at some point down the line. Udonis Haslem's an interesting one because he definitely has that that cult favorite status, and he's beloved by the franchise, and is even though, like I said, that kind of goes against the Pat Riley idea of greatness. I think he might have enough of a special status where he might get it despite it's kind of the Brad Davis type thing.
Oh yeah, he's the Pat Riley warrior. I think he values him high enough for UD to get in, and it will probably be an emotional night. And in a way, I guess it might even be more of a worthy of watching it than any of the big three getting in. Maybe besides Dwayne Wade, because just because of the fact that Udonis is from Miami himself and he's an undrafted player, and his story is so unique in a way. And as for the other guys, I think it even might require Pat Riley to retire for LeBron to get his one up there. But that probably will happen sometime in the future. Yeah,
well, I mean, the fact they've taken out of circulation, I would think that they have plans to do it. Of course, that's that's changing other circumstances. So I guess we'll see what that really means. But yeah, they obviously some fences may need to be mended there for that to happen. But I would guess everyone in that situation seems reasonable enough that it probably will happen.
Yeah, probably so.
So next is the Hawks, who have 6 banners up there, 5 numbers among them. Bob Pettit, number 9, Dominique Wilkins, Lou Hudson, Jason Collier, and Dikembe Mutombo, and also Ted Turner. So Ted Turner, he was given a jersey of 17, which was old Channel 17, which is what TBS originally was, but he does not actually have a number retired, but some people list 17. If you ever see that, that's the reason. So obviously the one that stands out there is Jason Collier, who died in 2005 at age 28 when he was with the team. He was caused by a cardiac rhythm disturbance caused by an enlarged heart. So no one has actually worn 40 for the Hawks since he died. So it's not officially retired, but it's taken out of circulation, and they say that no one is ever going to wear it again. But there is not a banner. I could have sworn at one point that he actually had a banner, but that he certainly doesn't have one now, and apparently he does not have one. The way they've honored him, though, is they have a community service award called the Jason Collier Memorial Trophy. They also, the D-League named its sportsmanship award after him in 2006, and the Hawks bring family members back at the end of the season to present the award, and they all wear Collier jerseys and buttons. So they've managed to kind of keep his legacy alive with the team. He didn't play that long with the team, only like a year and a half or so, but he played for Georgia Tech, so he had ties to Atlanta, and part of the community and his family, I think, are still in that area. So it's sort of a nice way to keep his legacy alive, and I think it's sort of a nice way to handle a situation where it's a little bit odd to have a banner of a player who was not a particularly good NBA player up there just because they passed away, but to do something like this, to kind of handle it that way, I think is a nice way to do it.
Yeah, it's sort of odd how this began to happen in the 2000s, because there certainly are some guys who passed away in the 80s, and then it certainly has happened beforehand. I think Nick Reinis was the name for a sort of similar Phoenix Suns center, in regards that he had a similar role on the team, and although Wendell Ladner is a good one from the 70s, but it doesn't happen always, and I obviously have nothing against it. It's cool that there's something positive from those 2003, 2004, and 04, 05 Atlanta Hawks teams, and it's their own choice to make, and it's certainly cool that he has a tribute paid him.
Yeah. I forgot to mention there's actually 6 number retired because Pete Maravich's number was retired in March of this year, or March of 2017. So his was recently retired as well. So one weird mystery that I could not figure it out, and I tried very hard. I talked to many of the basketball historians that I know, and they asked people. Adam Kribble asked some people in St. Louis, and no one could figure out exactly when Bob Pettit's number was retired. We even asked Todd Spear, who helped me out with a few other questions, but we could not figure that out. So if anybody listening happens to know that, I would love to know the answer. I assume it may have happened after when the team was still in St. Louis before it moved in '68, but I cannot guarantee that. Interesting, another player who was retired when they were still active was Lou Hudson. His jersey was retired March 1st of '77, and interestingly enough, Hudson was because Hudson was traded to the Lakers that fall. I didn't, before I realized what the date was, I had assumed it was the Lakers' first game. In Atlanta when he was playing for the Lakers, but it actually happened when he was still with the Hawks. It just he happened to be playing against the team he would later join. So it does seem like random timing. I could not find any particular reason why they did it during this time. I mean, he'd been with the team for about a decade, but was now a backup. Maybe he had passed some sort of number of games played, longevity type record. Beyond that, I don't really know. But so that's sort of an interesting thing to happen. He's definitely kind of a guy who's been lost in the shuffle. Not even seems like a deserving Hall of Famer. Not even in the Hall of Fame. At least he does have this honor for him. But it's kind of odd.
Yeah, and it does happen during a time, and I was looking this up as you were telling that story. It does happen a time when their managers change, where their general managers change. So there's always a possibility, that somebody wanted to do a move that is popular. But there you have it. There's our second guy who definitely got to play with the Lakers when at Atlanta when his number was up in the Raptors already.
I would say that in terms of surprises, I mean, Mutombo and Maravich didn't have a whole lot of longevity with the team. Obviously, they're very memorable players. And Mutombo, those late 90s Hawks were actually, fairly good teams. Frankly, they didn't have much success with Maravich. But both, I think, are understandable in terms of fame and impact, even if the longevity wasn't there. Some omissions. I mean, I think probably the biggest one would be Cliff Hagan, who's a Hall of Famer, was part of the Hawks from 57 to 66 when they won their championship and went to 4 finals in 5 years and were, a strong team for most of that period. He was one of the better forwards of his day and was a 5-time All-Star. And it was a Hall of Famer, inducted in the Hall of Fame in 78, but probably, because of the move from St. Louis to Atlanta, never got retired and then kind of got forgotten about. And then some guys from the 80s and 90s Hawks, if you look at Tree Rollins, who was there for quite a long time, Doc Rivers, who had a long time, John Drew, who was a really good scorer for them in the 70s into the early 80s, but then had drug problems is probably why he never got retired and not the most longevity they ever had. Somebody like Mookie Blaylock or Steve Smith, for the 90s teams. Blaylock had fairly strong longevity there. Again, none of those guys, other than Hagan, I don't think any of those guys are slam dunks. Maybe Rollins might have the best case given that he played like a dozen years for the franchise. And on the horizon, I don't know if there's really anybody who, you might think of like Al Horford or Joe Johnson, who were, good players for their recent, run of good teams. But beyond that, not really like one signature star that they've managed to, have over the last few years. They just kind of have lacked that for the most part.
Yeah, and I know that the timing is bad on this one, but I this is probably the retired jersey collection which I dislike the most because Dikembe is a very cool guy and I felt good for him, but you sort of don't connect him with Atlanta, and he's hurting due to his career arc, but there just isn't a particular team which he can call his own, and the fact that Cliff Hagan's number is still not up there, it creates a weird contrast, and Cliff Hagan is still alive and living in Kentucky, at least if I can trust Wikipedia, so I think you should get him on a plane. Louisville or wherever he lives, Louisville, Atlanta is a manageable flight, right? And I think you should do that as he's still around, and it definitely would be a nice look, and I think would be a decent thing to do.
Yeah,
and I'll add one more to your list of honorable mentions, which probably won't ever get retired. But Kevin Willis is also a name I thought of.
Oh,
but,
good point. Yeah, that would be up there too as well. Yeah. So next we have the Nets, and they have officially retired Draza Petrovic, Jason Kidd, Bill Melchione, Julius Erving, Buck Williams, and John Williamson. And they've also they took Wendell Ladner's number 4 out of circulation. He died in a plane crash in '75, and it was again not officially retired, and apparently never in the rafters, but was not used for almost 18 years until '93 when Rick Mahorn wore it from '93 to '96. And then it wasn't worn again until 2017 when Louis Scola wore it, and then Julia Okafor wears it now. And it was Ladner's number was actually on the official NBA.com list at least through 2011. So it's sort of interesting that that happened. And although I guess it's not official, if at one point it was official, he was only one of 2 ABA exclusive players to get their number retired by a team, Roger Brown being the other player. So that's sort of interesting. And Ladner's another case of a guy who's very popular, of course, a very colorful character from, we know the stories from Loose Balls and such, the Burt Reynolds style poster and all that, and good friend of Julius Erving and, important player for the Nets. And, but in another case of somebody who was maybe not because he wasn't a great player, not the official retirement, but it is kind of a bummer that they brought it back out of circulation. I mean, I don't know what was behind the decision, if Rick Mahorn really wanted it, or if there was just the management in the mid '90s wasn't particularly interested in keeping that promise. But that's a slight disappointment. But interesting history nonetheless.
Yeah, and Rick Mahorn had played with 44 after that point, and then that was Derrick Coleman's number with New Jersey. So I wonder, what was it really a situation where Mahorn just had to have his 4s? I don't know, but yeah, it's definitely disappointing that they sort of didn't keep that up.
Yeah. The first official retirement was Bill Melchioni in 1976, and of course he did play in the NBA, but was honored mainly for an ABA career. But it happened when the Nets finally joined the ABA. Probably better that it happened before the season, because as GM he was soon forced to trade Julius Erving away. So it'd be interesting if there had been a ceremony where after that had happened, whether he would have been booed at that point. I don't know if. Maybe he had enough love as a player where that wouldn't have happened, but I'm sure there would have been some disappointment over that for sure. And I guess the most surprising out of that list is probably Super John Williamson, who retired. It was retired in December of 1990. He passed away 6 years later at age 44. He had kidney problems for a long time. He was, of course, a key part of the Nets ABA title teams and helped carry them scoring wise in a couple stints after the Dr. J era. Had 16 fourth-quarter points against the Nuggets in Game 6 of the 76 Finals to seal up that win and that championship. Was known for not being afraid of taking the big shot. And he was quite sick by the time the Nets retired his jersey in a very emotional ceremony. So perhaps I'm sure his health was part of the reason, at least for the timing of that. But yeah, I wouldn't say there's really anybody in Nets history who's has been an omission. I think they've handled that pretty well. In terms of on the horizon, you could look at guys like Vince Carter, Richard Jefferson, or Brook Lopez, but I don't think any of those choices are like absolutely like I don't know. I don't want to speak for Nets fans, but I'm not sure any of them are like particularly exciting choices for the franchise.
Yeah, the history of the franchise just seems too weird because someone like Jefferson would be okay, but it's sort of the New Jersey days, and I don't know how many people in the Barclays Center were watching him and the Meadowlands, and yeah, these always work better if you get to retire the number before the team makes a move. And as we look back now, I think we can say that the ABA guys, the jerseys they retired there, those make sense. But now with every year that passes, I think a possibility for Carter, Jefferson, or even Lopez for that point, it almost seems like it doesn't make too much sense, and that's too bad for Brook Lopez, because I think he's the franchise leader in points, but which doesn't say much, but it's still an achievement.
Yeah, I think he just barely passed that mark before he was traded. I think he just literally got it right after that, or was very close to that. So that's interesting, yeah, given those facts. But yeah, he would, he would be an interesting choice, and he was kind of the original Brooklyn net to a certain extent, or at least they had the longest longevity, I'm sure, of any players of the original Brooklyn Nets. But yeah, I would guess that one probably isn't super likely. So next, the Chicago Bulls, who have 4 numbers retired and then 2 non-numbers. Jerry Sloan, Bob Love, Michael Jordan, and Scottie Pippen, and then Jerry Krause and Phil Jackson both had their initials retired. The first retired was Jerry Sloan in 1978. Of course, he was one of the great players and emotional leader for the early 70s Bulls, who were always, great teams that never quite got, over the hump. But really captured the city at the time, and were a very good player. He was known as Mr. Chicago Bull or the original Bull. It's interesting that Love and Sloan got their numbers retired, although Love wasn't until 1994. And Chet Walker and Norm Van Lier did not get theirs retired. Chet Walker had a big dispute with management and quit the team. There was accusations of racism and from Walker, and lots of there was a lot of strife among the team with Coach Dick Motta toward the end as well, in Motta being the general manager. And Norm Van Lier, there's a really interesting article from 1994 in the Chicago Reader, which I'll try to link in the show notes, on Van Lier. He was seemingly blackballed from the team after his playing career, and he thought that he would be, when Jerry Krause was hired as GM of the Bulls, he was a scout in the 70s. He thought he would be able to get held on, but then Krause refused to hire him, and there was a big dispute, a personal dispute between the two. And when Krause was asked about retiring Van Lier's jersey, he said, "That's not my decision." And then Van Lier later said, "There was a time I might have died to have that, but I'm past that. I see the banners they've got, and I know there's a little piece of me up there with them. I was the point guard. I fed them the ball. I gave up my blood for the Bulls. They can't take that from me. Now we move on to other things." So before he passed away, he had a broadcasting career, and had his voice in another way. But yeah, he's sort of an odd choice, just because Walker and Van Lier were both really important parts of that team. Kind of similar to the Pacers, where there were, even though they didn't have the same team success, there were really 4 players that keyed that team, and were fairly equal important parts of making that team go.
Yeah, and it's too bad that it seemingly, at least from what I could read into in that article, you mentioned that seemingly a strife between Krause and Norman Lear is something that prevented him from ever getting his night, and unfortunately Norman Lear has passed away since. And I really wish someone like Paxson or Gar Forman had the idea to mend those issues, because the people for whom the two probably didn't have the best word to say, they are long gone from the organization, and it's sad that Norm never got the chance to have his night, and yet they can still do right by Chet Walker. And I think it's as cheesy as it sounds, I think it would simply be the right thing to do. So I think they should use that chance.
Yeah, definitely. Some other players who you could definitely have some consideration: Artis Gilmore, Horace Grant, Dennis Rodman, Tony Kukoc. Grant and Rodman obviously were important parts of the championship teams. Didn't have the most longevity. Rodman was really only there for 3 years. Kukoc was there for longer. Obviously strong six man. More again. The Bulls have been they've been pretty stingy about their retirement numbers. So. He seems less likely. I don't know, anyone on there who you think has a particularly strong case?
Not really, because again, it's tough to compete with Jordan and Scottie, and I in a way this is almost where the Magic Hall of Fame makes more sense. And I know that in their case they're waiting for their own Jordan and Scottie Pippen to retire their numbers, but I feel like in the Bulls case it would almost be like a way to recognize the second tier of players, because I feel like Luol Deng, Noah, Taj Gibson, and Derrick Rose, they are Bulls Hall of Famers, and it might look silly if Gibson's 22 was hanging right beside Jordan's 23, and you probably don't want to make that happen. And that's where your own Hall of Fame comes into play, because it's just so odd to make a case for these guys. And then that even if Tony and Dennis Rodman were around for those titles, it seems like they're on in a whole nother level.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the 2000s guys, there's a lot of guys who are sort of interesting, who played there for quite a long time and had some success. I mean, you look at Kirk Heinrich, Luol Deng, Joakim Noah, Derrick Rose, of course, with the MVP. If he doesn't get if he doesn't get his jersey retired, he'd only be the second MVP besides Bob McAdoo not to get their jersey retired. Jimmy Butler as well, of course, leaving for the Wolves, probably not the enough longevity there, but. I mean, of those guys, I would say maybe Noah or Rose would be kind of have the best cases in a way. I mean, Butler might have been the better player, but I think Noah, was there longer, had more, was kind of the emotional leader, and was a like a fringe MVP candidate and all NBA kind of guy, and Rose with the MVP. I could see this maybe the credentials being stronger there, but yeah, I don't. I kind of agree with you. I don't think there's really anybody who stands out there, and more like a Bulls Hall of Fame might be a more appropriate way to handle that.
Yeah, and I wonder if they have their division banner up there, because those words by Van Leer, Norman Lear, the fact that he can look up at Sloan and Love, and that he feels like at least there's something up in the rafters, that those words really got to me. But on the other hand, I feel like a division banner is such a silly way to commemorate a team, especially when you have 6 championships right besides that. So yeah, it almost seems like something where you take the spirit of that team, and it also goes out to Phibbs, who probably is remembered more positively in Chicago than negatively, even if he did ride his players into the ground. It feels like that whole team as a whole is something that deserves a banner if they don't get one personally. But yeah, I'm not too big on division winning banners.
No, yeah, I agree that like I get, yeah, there's not really a good way to honor them, honestly, even though they do have some cases for recognition. There's kind of a whole era there that there isn't, like I said, maybe Rose with the MVP would be kind of the one guy who would kind of like represent all those guys, even though he kind of has his issues that you would make it not want to honor him. But yeah, there isn't really a good answer to that. That's kind of a tough one.
Yeah, and that's perhaps an idea. Maybe teams could hang up a Derrick Rose MVP banner, and the same could apply to someone like Bob McAdoo, who doesn't have a place to call his own. Maybe that's something that could happen. I don't know. Somebody could be really innovative with an idea like this.
Yeah, definitely. So next is the Warriors, who have 6 numbers retired: Wilt Chamberlain, Tom Meschery, Al Attles, Chris Mullin, Rick Barry, and Nate Thurmond. And interesting, you had him as a guest on your podcast. Why don't you talk a little bit about the circumstances of his jersey retirement?
Oh yeah, Tom Meschery was not that thrilled that he would be leaving his the team that drafted him and his own hometown team, because Tom Meschery is a San Francisco guy, and he was planning to retire and perhaps joining the Peace Corps, and then he was later convinced to play with Seattle, but yeah, at that point the arrangements had been made, and he might have been the first guy, as we're learning through this conversation, he who got his jersey retired when he was still in the league, and he was visiting with the Seattle Supersonics, and that's how such a franchise with such history, which has many great names up there and has a couple of more of them upcoming. That's how Tom Meschery is the first Warrior ever to be retired. Which looking back at it, I guess there could be some Warriors fans nowadays for whom it raises some questions. But as you've noted, and probably can elaborate on more, he was a pretty good player.
Yeah, I mean, he was an all-star once. He helped lead the team to 2 finals. He, as you mentioned, had ties to the area through high school and college. So, yeah, he's not obviously that well known now. So it's now modern fans look at it and are like, who? But it made more sense at the time. I mean, he's definitely one of the more marginal cases, but he was is I guess an original San Francisco Warrior, so to speak. So and as we've we'll see even as we go further, there are a lot of guys who, the first player for the franchise or the first player in the city who lasts the longest ends up getting, their jersey retired there. So, and given the circumstances that he had planned to retire, it made some sense. So, and I would say there's several omissions, I think, in the franchise. There's no representation from their Philly days in which they won, championships in 47 or 56. I mean, obviously, Chamberlain played in Philly, but beyond that, no one there played in or had a significant time playing in Philadelphia, I should say. Paul Arizin, who's the franchise's third all-time leading scorer, in second all-time in win shares. He's only one of two top 50 players without their jersey retired. I mean, he definitely is someone who, would merit it. And given, the team isn't, obviously the team moved before they had retired any jerseys, and that wasn't really something that was thought about in 62 when the team moved. But other guys from that era, Neil Johnston, Tom Gola, and Joe Folks from the very early days, one of the great early scorers. I mean, all those guys, would definitely merit it. And it's kind of hard now to see what they could do. Maybe some sort of banner for the, to recognize the Philadelphia, maybe the 56 championship team or what have you, or the two championship. They do have banners for the championships themselves, but something similar to what the Lakers did for the Minneapolis team. That we'll get to that in more detail, but that might be a nice way to do it. I mean, Arizin certainly of anybody, would merit one, but that's hard given that he had no connection with the San Francisco. In fact, he left the team rather than go to San Francisco.
Yeah, and we'll get to it as you mentioned. I think the Lakers really show the other teams that there is a solution here, and I was really surprised about Jeff Mullins because if I had to take a quiz, I would have guessed it that his jersey was retired because he was already with the franchise after they had moved to San Francisco, and then definitely those guys deserve it. But I figured that Jeff Mullins was up there.
Yeah, he was a three-time All-Star, played on the 67-75 Warriors, the championship and the finals team. So it seems like he was an important contributor to both those teams, especially in 67. So would merit it, but somehow got lost in the shuffle there. Some of the guys, you could look at like a Mitch Richmond or a Tim Hardaway. Hardaway probably with the stronger case because he was there longer. And there probably isn't really anyone who stands out from the We Believe team. The 07 team that upset the Mavericks. I mean, that was obviously Baron Davis was really good, but he didn't last that much longer. Steven Jackson. Those guys are all very much cult favorites, but they didn't have a lot of longevity with the franchise, and that obviously that success did not sustain itself. Monta Ellis, and even more importantly, with the success they've had in the past 3 or 4 years with all the championships and the finals teams. I mean that team is going to, when the time comes, obviously they're going to get a lot of honors, and I think it's pretty much going to prevent anyone else from doing it because it's obviously by far the best period in Warriors history. I mean, Curry, I would imagine Durant, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson are all strong candidates to get their jerseys retired. I could see possibly, depending on how deep they want to go, Andre Iguodala, Sean Livingston, guys who've been there for a long time and are important role players as well. I could see any of those guys, certainly a chance of it happening.
Yeah, Iggy's Finals MVP might help him, and then though the stats aren't there, his move from Utah, and the fact that his role on the team was integral to allowing them to play the way they do, he might get there. And something I just thought of in regards to the We Believe team is that you could just retire the man behind the master plan because Don Nelson certainly spent some time with the Warriors. I think that would be nice. He's definitely synonymous with franchise.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would make a lot of sense as well. I don't know if they've did like a 10th anniversary thing for that team or what have you, but although I guess that would be I guess that was the 07 playoffs, so it's been 11 years.
They attended one of the first round games, I think, in the last year's playoffs, and I remember that because the native of my home country, Andres Biedrinch, for whatever reason didn't want to go, and all the rest of the gang was pretty much there, save for I don't know a couple of guys. I'm not certain about someone like Mikal Pietrus, but the Americans were there.
And that's the end of part 1 of this episode. Stay tuned from part 2. It should be here in a couple of days. Hope you are enjoying it. And You can find us at The Step Back at fansided.com, also on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and find us on Facebook or Twitter at Over and Back NBA. So thanks for listening. We'll be back again soon.